Welcome
Hello.
back. Damn it, Sriram. Now I got to start my welcome back over. Welcome back
Jesus Christ.
to the worst produced podcast in MMA. This is the Fight Site MMA podcast. I am the host, Dan Martin, and I'm here with my co-host, as always, Sriram. And today we are joined once again by our good friend and colleague, Julian Lung. Julian, how are you today?
Hello.
We got lucky this last weekend because we expected the event UFC 251 to be a bummer, and it wasn't nearly as much of a bummer as I think we thought it was going to be, and that's very cool. There were two of the main fights that we're going to talk about today. I think everyone was thinking about probably the two best fights on the card: Alexander Volkanovsky versus Max Holloway 2, and Peter Yan versus Jose Aldo for the bantamweight title. Both were absolutely terrific. A little sad in parts, but we'll touch on that later. We'll discuss a little bit about Kamaru Usman versus Jorge Masvidal. As I said, I don't think there's a whole ton to really mine into there. And we are going to give a little bit of a preview to the following fights coming up this week, one of which is actually tomorrow when we're recording this, Calvin Kattar versus Dan Ige. And then one that's on Saturday, which is Deiveson Figueiredo versus Joseph Benavidez 2. A lot of rematches, a lot of strange bookings, but as we saw this last weekend, sometimes it actually works out. So a bit of a packed schedule, but we're going to try to get to all of it today. But first and foremost, we are here to talk about the recent pay-per-view. And like I said, one that surprised a lot of us, given Sriram how pessimistic Hacks was on our last podcast with his slogan, "Thanks COVID, I hate it." I tweeted at him after the fight was over. I was like, you know what, COVID? I didn't hate it this time. I didn't hate it. So before we jump into the two fights that we're kind of most excited to talk about, we should spare a little bit of discussion on the main event. Kamaru Usman defending his title against Jorge Masvidal. Masvidal showing up on, like a week's notice to get there. Bit of a routine title defense for Kamaru Usman. Julian, what were your takeaways here?
I mean, I thought it was pretty much what we all thought, that Masvidal is going to come in. He's going to come in probably a little bit out of shape. He's probably going to be able to somewhat stall against Usman, and he just kind of did. But we all figured that Usman is defensively smart enough, and he's just not Covington, where he's just going to take some shots to give some shots. Usman is defensively sound enough to sort of let some shots roll off on his shoulders, and he's just going to shoot in and just sort of just mess up Jorge in the clinch. And that's just kind of what happened. It's another Kamaru Usman fight where his opponent doesn't just give him the finish, and he just kind of just grinds out another decision.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's one thing that I think we mentioned before the fight if you look at a fight like RDA Usman, which is that holding Usman off generally isn't enough to win the fight, because he's A, good enough, and B, just absolutely dogged enough that you can't really beat him where he's good. So someone like Leon Edwards is probably running into that same problem. But Masvidal, he was very good in the clinch. He was very good as a wrestler. That's something that Ed can probably touch more on. I think he's writing something about this. But he was very good as a wrestler in general. It's just that he got stuck in a place where Usman could do his work, even if it isn't optimal. So he was stuck in the clinch and eating those little body shots. It was a consistent and attritive performance from Kamaru Usman that it wasn't necessarily exciting, but it was impressive in that eventually Usman just did what he wanted to do. And that's hard against someone like Masvidal, because Masvidal is genuinely very good. But Usman, he's hard to beat in the most annoying way, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think we all saw what was going to happen. We all expected Usman to do what he did, but I think it just kind of surprised all of us that Kamaru Usman doesn't take body kicks very well, and that's just the biggest thing I took away from that. And he genuinely struggled to sort of realize what was going to happen when Masvidal just ran at him. And I don't know how far that's going to take him. Probably not, just because no one's going to really charge Kamaru Usman very often unless you're Colby Covington or Jorge Masvidal. And I think you can sort of catch Usman out cold. But in terms of the first round, I just think that Usman did the right thing. He sort of just felt his way around, and just like you said, Sriram, he just it was just an attritive performance. And hats off to Usman just to do what he wanted to do.
I want to give some shine to this because I don't know how much we've really talked about it, but it's worth discussing. Is Kamaru Usman gets compared to Khabib a lot as a fighter, and I think in broad strokes, I understand why. I think that we need to give a little bit of shine to Usman as a structured fighter, because I think he's pretty underappreciated in his structure. I think his footwork is, he does a really good job with his footwork in terms of pressuring, cutting off the cage. Recently, he's done a much better job of attacking the body, and I've mentioned like little sort of interstitial moments, whether it's little clinch tie-ups. He'll just sneak one body shot in there. When guys throw at him, he tries to throw back with something, whether, usually it is kind of like a long straight right to the body. He's still not the most comfortable or, fluid or deep striker in the division, but he's clearly getting a system, and he's comfortable under fire. He's definitely improved out of sight in that area for a guy who kind of got, he kind of shit his pants when Emil Weber Mech started throwing back at him, and he sort of just kind of had to sell out with his wrestling. I like how Usman attacks in transitions. I'm sure we'll talk about this more later with Volkanovsky. So even if he can't get a takedown, he'll kind of give it up and try to land a punch on the way up. He's very active in all these areas. It's, like I said, it's subtle, but he has genuinely learned to work in very, in both broad strategic senses, like I need to push my opponents back and wrestle them along the fence. Like that is who he is. I want to applaud Usman for building, a kind of structured game in a lot of the smaller areas. If he can't get that A game rolling, he's actually able to threaten a lot of different pieces at the same time. And that was kind of what was really interesting here, was how much Masvidal was stifled, right? Because, I think you pointed out, Julian, that charging Usman might be a way to catch him out cold, but the risk in charging Usman is that you can also wind up just getting intercepted. He can grab a hold of you when you try to do that. He'll again, and if you try to break him quickly, he'll try to throw a body shot or two in there to just deposit into the bank, for later in the fight when you're exhausted. I felt like Masvidal's biggest chance was to kind of draw Usman out early and then crack him with something big. But, as we saw, that's generally kind of hard to do. And I think I really do want to applaud. I think a lot of that comes back to Usman's system as a fighter. And I don't know how much praise he gets for that, but it's a worthwhile one, and probably one that means signals he's likely to be a pretty long-term champ at 170. Sriram, what do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that you look at it with the Khabib comparison is in comparison to Khabib's fight against Gleison Tibau. Because, I mean, that was quite a long time ago, and I'm not sure it applies to the current crop of contenders he's facing. But you have to look at how, when Khabib was kind of stalled out in the clinch by a very strong grip fighter like Gleison Tibau, he kind of just didn't do much. And that's the kind of thing where you're not going to see that with Kamaru Usman, because we actually just saw it with Jorge Masvidal, which is Masvidal looked like a very good wrestler. He couldn't really get a ton going on top all of the time. And even when, like, for example, the first sequence with the front headlock, Masvidal just fought grips and got out. And against the fence, Masvidal just controlled his wrist like a motherfucker and just didn't let go. And in those spaces, Usman wasn't, like, baffled. Usman didn't, stick to trying to get to the body lock and, like, go, do my thing. He adapted, and he just started digging to the body, racking up points. That's the kind of thing that you don't see a ton from wrestling types. And Usman, he hasn't transcended that archetype, certainly, but he's made ways to make it work against guys who can't necessarily just be manhandled. So that's very impressive to me. I think Leon Edwards is a compelling fight, but not necessarily a particularly close one, as much as I hate to say it, because I love Leon, but he's just not the kind to, like, deny the clinch. If anything, he's going to welcome it. So moving forward, I'm not sure who does what to Kamaru Usman. And if he keeps improving, it's a very scary proposition to me.
Yeah, I think going off of what Danny said, the structure thing, I think going to Whitman did kind of help Usman. This might be a Whitmanism, but, like, a lot of his fighters' tendencies, like, if they know they're going to be exchanging after a shot, they tend to overthrow their punches. Like Gaethje does this a lot. Rose does this, right? After a big right hand, they tend to just fall off the right hand and just sort of duck to their left. And we kind of saw that with Usman. Like when he felt like he was going to be in exchange, he would just overthrow his right hand and kind of duck into a clinch or like a takedown opportunity. And I think that's just sort of something that we're seeing in Usman, where he's becoming more aware that if he just keeps limiting exchanges, he's just going to get takedowns over and over again, or he's just going to get clinch exchanges, which he just always wins. But I think in terms of his hardest competition, it's probably just Leon. But even then, like you said, I don't think Leon will be really successful unless he shows us something that we haven't seen before. I mean, he's gotten better as a clinch fighter, but in terms of like wrestling, we haven't quite seen him tested yet.
I think that is kind of the way it seems, isn't it? Like Leon's great, but he does have a tendency to forego a bit of cagecraft on the back foot. He can be pushed back. I mean, he's comfortable there. Don't think he's going to be quite so comfortable there with Kamaru Usman grabbing a hold of him. And again, it seems one of the things that I really do want to applaud with Kamaru Usman and why I think he is the best welterweight that we've seen since George is because Usman has built a very smart game for dealing with this division. Like, pushing someone back to the fence and wrestling them is a fine game for what it is. He has now branched that with, he branched that first with like an improved kind of clinch offense. And then, then he improved his footwork and, his combination punching. And now I said he sort of started working these interstitial exchanges. What I'm getting at is it is very difficult to build a structured game to combat Usman. Like, I think Usman, even more than a fighter like Khabib, is someone that there's only a handful of people that I'd really pick confidently over Usman, given the style that he has. And I'm not sure that any of them are welterweights. You need like a Robert Whittaker or like a Jose Aldo type defensive wrestler and back foot fighter to actually stifle Usman. You need someone who's extremely voracious in either framing out of the clinch or someone who can beat him there, which, as Julian said, is also kind of unlikely. So probably just stifling him. And that is that, like, you kind of have to build structures to get yourself in these positions to take advantage of that. And Usman is just really, really good at denying it. Sriram, do you have one more thing? Because I don't have a whole lot left on this one. It was pretty, just kind of a seminal performance from Kamaru Usman, I guess you'd say.
You could go back to the Khabib comparison once again, because I think one thing that people look at a lot with that is Khabib's top game versus Usman's top game. It's like people are like, oh, yeah, Usman neutralizes, Khabib dominates is one thing that I've seen quite a bit. And I think that kind of misses the point, because if you look at a division like lightweight, A, Usman would also dominate it, and B, if you look at what they've done when they've been cut off, Khabib hasn't been in a place to be cut off, but when he has, he's been drastically less effective. So you're looking at someone who, when they get to their place, they're incredibly dominant, versus someone who, when he gets to his place, he's marginally less dominant, but he can also work in other phases. And I think the fact that Usman has so many options, like just in terms of takedowns, right? He can do it against the fence. He can do it in the open, as he did to Masvidal. He can like parry kicks, which is one thing that we were very impressed with Usman doing early in the fight against Masvidal, to parry the kick across and shoot the takedown. It's a type of game where you're not going to have to lose against anyone who's not like specifically designed to beat you. And I think that's just not something, as you mentioned, it's not something that exists at welterweight. It's arguably not something that exists very much in MMA as a whole. Because if you look at anti-wrestlers, it's just that you mentioned the two big ones, Jose Aldo, Robert Whittaker. After that, you've got, I don't even know. There really aren't many. There's like Abdul Vakabov, I guess, but like not really. So it's tough to find someone. And that's pretty much exactly what you need. Usman, he might not be super long for the elite because of his knees and stuff, but he is early in his career, so there's some stuff to look forward to with him.
And he also just, to add one last thing, he also just isn't really taking a lot of damage fighting this way. I'm sure the Colby fight was the most damage he's taken probably in his entire career, and that was still Colby Covington throwing punches at him. Like, it's pretty risk averse in a lot of ways. So, yeah, like I said, I'm I'm still excited to see what he does next. He'll always be an interesting one to see if fighters can figure him out. Not the most exciting fight, but I think we've kind of run that one dry. So moving on to the co-main, which is really kind of, I'm sure, what we're here for. Volkanovsky defeats Holloway again, kind of, by split decision in my pick for the fight of the year. And just one of the best and most high-level fights I've seen in a long time. Very different approach from Holloway in this fight, and a lot of adjustments made on both sides. I'm going to kick it to Sriram. Start me at the beginning. What do you think?
Yeah, I think so. The theme of the first fight was Volkanovski attacking Holloway's step-in with big counter right hands and the left hook, obviously, and the leg kicks, which became the dominant narrative of the fight. But one thing that Max did in this fight, just broadly, was to kind of take that step-in away, and that's hard to say because the first time he stepped in, it was like a couple seconds into the fight, he ate that same counter, right? But then he started letting Volkanovski come to him a little bit more. That was early in the fight, and then he started pressuring more consistently, and that he wasn't, going in out. He was pressuring more consistently, pushing Volkanovski to the fence, stepping in with like knees and counters and stuff. And I think it was a really interesting against type performance from Max, because if you look at what Max used to be, he was not a counter puncher who dropped guys with a single punch. That's like the opposite of what he used to be. So it was not quite an inversion of what we've seen before, but played out that way. And a lot of that credit goes to Volkanovski, because the fact that he managed to pull the fight back from Max Holloway, kind of seeming to figure the fight out, kicking with Volkanovski on the outside, running him into uppercuts, which was one of the most important parts of the fight, in my opinion, because Volkanovski, a lot of what he does is he dips in off his jab, and Holloway seemed very prepared for that in the rematch. And the body kicking worked out well to occupy his guard, and the head kick eventually slipped through. It was a very educated performance from Max, but Volkanovski pulled it back. It was very, very smart from both. And I think Max edged it, but at the end of the day, I really can't be angry about Volkanovski taking it because the momentum was on his side by the end.
Yeah, I actually think Max, showed us a lot of, he sort of went back to what made him really fun and great, is that he went back to kicks. But what surprised me is he never threw a southpaw body kick. And this is a big thing for me that I was hoping that Max would do, because, Max showed it against Pettis. He had a beautiful body kick and just kept punting him to the body. And Volkanovski just always leans back. And my issue is that Max just never threw, a switch left kick or even a southpaw body kick. I know that there was a takedown threat, but that didn't come until the fourth, fifth round. And it just surprised me, I think, that Max, he spent all this time learning to throw really great kicks, but he just never punted to the body with his left kick. And the few times that he did throw a switch kick to the head, Volk barely got his hands up ready to block it. So, I think it was a really great performance. I think the Alda fight is my fight of the year, but for Max, I think it's a really good step in the right direction. We're just gonna have to see, has the damage sort of piled up, and where is he gonna go next?
I was incredibly encouraged by this fight from Holloway's perspective, especially considering where we came in and how low our expectations were. Like I said, I wasn't sure how much Max was actually capable of adjusting his style, because something that I pointed out after the Poirier fight when he fought Edgar and he looked a little shaky, I was like, I don't know how much of this is Max doesn't want to exchange anymore, but I also don't know if some of this has to do with Max overcorrecting a mistake. Feeling like his problem was defense. He's so okay, I'm defensively minded. I'm not going to initiate as much. I'm going to be a lot more careful. And it didn't really play to his strengths. And I didn't know if that sort of mindset, that sort of conscious mindset, was something that was potentially holding him back. And this looked like the fight that he had been trying to fight for the last couple performances. He was, as Sriram pointed out, he was better at not just leading with the sort of regular step in. He retracted his lead leg better. He would kind of half step feint this time around to draw Volkanovski out. he didn't overly rely on his jab, which was big because his jab has been his opening strike for almost everything else. It's been like his leading feint. He'll use it. He'll use his jab in a variety of different ways, but he had a lot more diversity in his entries here, and that was huge. Like you guys already talked about the kicking, but like was more likely to kind of feint with a half step, get Volkanovski biting, and then instead of throwing like a feinted jab and a right hand, he would just throw the right hand. And so, like, Volkanovski didn't have it as easy a time seeing it because I think Volkanovski has learned to train so much of his responses and his kicks and so forth off of Holloway's jab that Max not giving that to him was a really wise adjustment. Countered better, obviously. The better counterpunching was something that's the kind of adjustment and improvement it's hard to expect a fighter to make. Like you shouldn't when we were going into this fight, we could probably point out improved counterpunch. In fact, I think we might have with Hacks or Eyes Sriram, maybe we did. That would be a good thing here, but you can't expect a fighter to do that unless you've seen it, but Max did it here. He countered, as Sriram said, like the Volkanovski's kind of ducking entries. He countered with the uppercut, which is actually a weapon that I pointed out that I thought would be important the first time around. In general, like if I kind of boil it down to a broader stroke, Max did a much better job of preventing Volkanovski from getting free shots. And that was kind of the story of the first fight, is that Volk was just able to build up a big lead because he's, with his leg kicks. And again, Volkanovski, credit to him. He was still incredibly diligent and became increasingly clever with them as the fight went on. Like, I'm not expecting you to get rid of all of them, but he was able to get off a lot of free shots early, and Max just didn't let him do that. And that was really smart. I really loved seeing Max. He moved his head as a trigger off of the leg kicks. Like, it was really nice. When Volkanovski kind of started that inside stepping leg kick to like overhand, which we've seen kickboxers throw a lot. It's kind of a city kickboxing thing too. Like Max, like preemptively started moving his head as a trigger off of the inside leg kick, which is exactly the kind of proactive defense that he should be using. He should be doing more of that. Like that was really nice. From Volkanovski's end, I think that one of the things I pointed out in my notes here is that Volkanovski is such a fun fighter to watch because he's so diligent in how he builds. Like you can definitely see it in his first fight with Max, where he's less committal with the leg kicks early, and then he sort of opens up with shifting combinations, and he doubles and triples up in combinations, but it all sort of starts from the same base. And he had to build quicker because Max built up such an early lead this time around. And he started doing that. He started jabbing more. He started drawing Max onto his check hook, which was super nice. I just pretty much almost every exchange had layers and depth to it, and craft that, again, I was not expecting to see from both of these guys. I thought it was brilliant.
Danny, how'd you feel about Max's body punching? Just because, like, I think he threw quite a few jabs to the body, but I just don't really recall him going back to the body. I know Volk is like a short dude, but I think
that's kind of what
body
I think.
work. Huh?
Yeah, I think you nailed it. Is like, I think it's a height thing.
Yeah.
Going to the body on a shorter opponent, I don't think he's quite as comfortable doing. Like I'm sure if you gave Max Zabit next, I'm sure he would be a lot more willing to sort of, throw that body jab. He wouldn't have to bend down nearly as far. His right hand, which, his hands usually keeps them around shoulder level. Like he could just throw a right hand to the body without having to really change his posture that much. I think against Volkanovski was a little bit tougher. And Volkanovski keeps a longer range before he steps in. And, when Max tried to step in late in their first fight, that was when he got countered. So I think you're kind of on the mark there. I did like the body jab a lot. And I also really got to give credit to Volkanovski's body work. I thought that his long like left hook to the body and then using that as an entry into the clinch is just awesome. Like that is exactly it's the kind of stuff that RDA does. But if I had to guess, I think that's probably why.
Yeah, I'm just surprised that like Max, I think in the first round he showed a lot of like stepping in step knees and just he kept raising his legs. I'm like, okay, this is a Max Holloway where he's going to start throwing a lot of snap kicks to the body and push kicks. Just because, Volkanovski does have the tendency to sort of like lean back on some shots and lean back on his kicks. Like this would be a really great opportunity to see, snap kicking Max Holloway. But yeah, I guess sort of Max sort of got stuck in the headhunt later on, after especially since he sort of dropped Volk in the first 2 rounds. He probably thought he could probably get away with more headshots, but I would like to see Max go to the body a bit more later on.
I liked some of Max's body kicking in the fight, though, because he couldn't really punch, as you mentioned. Volkanovski being so short made it weird to do. Even though he did manage some of it in the first fight, he threw like these long right hands to the body. But I mean, it might have just been that he didn't get much out of it, or he didn't have the range right. But this time he did a lot of weird right kicks through the closed side. Because one thing that the benefit of the southpaw body kick was that it would go right through the open side and occupy the hands. But one thing that Max did very well in this fight was he was able to throw lead leg kicks to the head often, which occupied Volkanovski's hands the way we expected that to. And he was able to slip in some nice right kicks underneath Volk's lead elbow, which worked well. I mean, it didn't really do much to Volkanovski in terms of attrition, but, they scored points, and if it was someone less durable, it probably would have had an effect. But, yeah, and he actually was able to draw Volkanovski onto a couple nice knees. It wasn't the most body attacking performance from Max, but I think it was just, he didn't have the long flurries at his disposal with that kind of counterpuncher in front of him. So it's understandable.
So when Sriram and Hacks and I discussed this fight or previewed this fight last week, Hacks had a good point in that he's like, I don't really know if we need to spend a lot of time breaking down the individual exchanges. I think a lot of this fight can be covered in the broad strategic sense, which is, again, why we were kind of pessimistic about previewing it. Now, I do think there were a lot of individual exchanges here, as I mentioned earlier. But if we take a step back, I do want to discuss this fight a little bit in a broader sense, because maybe this is just because I wrote an article about adjustments a week ago. But I want to highlight, like, I don't think a lot of people understand how difficult it is to make these kinds of adjustments so late into your career against a seemingly like incredibly difficult style matchup in Volkanovski. Like, I do agree, Julian. I think that Max is probably moving towards a different phase in his career. I think the guy who, just buzzsawed Brian Ortega with like 12, 13, 14 punch combinations at a time is probably not there anymore. But I think that this was a far more encouraging performance for his later career, because it looked like a synthesis of some of the things he was trying in the Edgar fight and the first Volkanovski fight. And he's actually finding a way to synthesize that with his core skill set so it doesn't feel quite so foreign, if that makes sense. Like, that is what I mean about like the counterpunching, and like he had to go back and kind of dig further into his skill set with some stuff that seemingly got pared down, like the kicking. His feints, as we said, his entries, he learned to diversify them a lot more. He was more aware of the threats that Volkanovski offered. Like, even if you don't score this fight for him, and it's perfectly fine if you don't, but I do want to highlight how difficult it is to make those kinds of effective adjustments against a fighter like Volkanovski, who is always willing to adjust with you as well. Like, that was the thing that really kind of hammered it home for me. It was like the fifth round was a really clear one for Volk. You can debate 3 and 4, but like the fifth one was a really strong round for Volkanovski, and that was where his transitional work really got going. It seemed like he did seem, as Phil McKenzie pointed out, he kind of ran out of ideas in dealing with the leg kicks. It started building up a bit more. But like against an incredibly disciplined adjuster to actively try to make adjustments, in a first fight that felt pretty thorough in terms of how Volkanovski beat him, like that's remarkable. And that is great. Like it is great to see because you almost never see it. I did point out, I don't know if it was in this one or another preview that we've done a while back, Sriram, but I know we've talked about this before. When you have a fight that between two fighters that seems pretty one-sided, usually a title fight of some kind, and they want an immediate rematch, the one thing that you can say for the guy who lost is that if you approach a fight so categorically badly, it does open up a lot of possibilities in a rematch just because it kind of tells you everything that you can't do. So, when it comes to a rematch, your options in terms of improving are massive. That doesn't necessarily mean that you should favor the losing fighter. That's a risky game. We understand why. But it does mean that there are chances. Like when you approach a fight wrong and it proves to be wrong, you can at least expect that there are, a lot of possibilities of things you could do in the future. But like I said, I wrote an article on why that's difficult and why that's unlikely. So to actually see it in action was really remarkable. Like this was a phenomenal fight from both guys. And I think we just have to give a ton of credit in terms of like the depth and craft that they offered. And it was just so completely not what I expected. So.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing about the counterpunching especially is that it isn't just a adjustment in terms of like knowing what to do, because I think that's the kind of thing we expected from Max if he adjusted at all. Because like before the fight, there was he's training over Zoom and he's saying, well, because a point fighter, this isn't going to go well, because clearly he thinks he can just do what he did the first time and it'll work. But he didn't just figure out what he has to do within his existing game. He kind of sharpened up some things that he usually doesn't do at all. Because as a counterpuncher, Max really hasn't been a ton. He has a counter jab that he showed against Frankie Edgar and Volkanovski the first time. He has a check hook, but stuff like counter uppercuts isn't really stuff that Max did a ton. He did some against Frankie Edgar, but he had such a margin there. It's not really a part of Max's skill set that you would have expected to be adjustable in that sort of context to that extent. So if you look at something like, Volkanovski coming in, doing his thing, it's like, oh yeah, Max isn't going to counter me. He's probably just going to drop back. And Max just threw him off completely. And that's something that you really don't expect. One, just in general, because that's just not something that fighters do in the sport very much. And two, in the stage of the career that Max is in, because Max isn't a fresh face. He's young for an absolute legend, a greatest of all time contender, but he's been in the game for a while, and this isn't the point where you expect him to make massive strides to start like countering jabs with right hands more frequently, or like figuring out how to counter Volkanovski's jab with the uppercut. It actually parallels a lot of what I think about Volkanovski did in the first fight, because Max kind of figured out a few specific situations and hammered it so that he wouldn't need a ton of depth as a counterpuncher to make it work, which is just another credit to him as an adaptable fighter, because he figured out exactly where Volkanovski was vulnerable so he could apply that skill set even if it isn't the best for him. I really have nothing bad to say about both guys. I think Max kind of destroys anyone he faces next time. Same with Volkanovski. I don't know if there are compelling options for him other than Max. But, obviously I don't really want a third fight right now. I feel much better about it than I did about the rematch, but it's not really the kind of thing where I want Max to go on like a 3-loss skid to the same person. That would suck a lot. So do like Max Zabit, as you mentioned, Max Yair Rodriguez, something like that. Give Korean Zombie to Volk. And then some cool fights in the featherweight division, but those two seem like they're in a tier of their own.
Yeah, I think I co-sign with all that. Like I said, for me, it's my fight of the year, and as Julian pointed out, if it's not that one, it probably is going to be either Jan Alda, which we're going to talk about in a second. But yeah, this was this was incredibly encouraging, and I wish people would shut up about the scoring because like it was a close fight, right? Like I don't really have an issue with it. You know, if there's one thing, it would have been nice to see Max get it just because it would have ensured a third fight. And I don't know if that's entirely ensured, but like it was a close fight. Get over it. All right, moving on to fight number 3. This is where it gets kind of sad, particularly the stoppage, which we could talk about in a bit. But this was also remarkable in its own way. I'm gonna send it to Julian. Peter Yan beats Jose Aldo by 5th round TKO, but Aldo giving Yan the fight of his life. How did it happen?
Well, first off, I think this is probably one of the better outcomes we can see from Jose Aldo, just because he didn't look absolutely shot against Yan. And he went back to the low kicks, which is something that we were all hoping he would go back to, but we just never saw him go back to it for a really long time. So it was just a really encouraging performance from Aldo, but it was just incredibly sad given that he was fighting at a weight class he should never be in. This is mostly a fight that, like I would call a gunslinger fight. It was sort of like two guys just standing right in front of each other and just sort of just baiting each other, having a game of chicken to see who would go first or who would just bite on the biggest feint. And a lot of times it was just Aldo biting on feints because Aldo's quite trigger happy, and Aldo is, like you said, Danny, he's often just a coil of energy. And Aldo just always wants to explode on somebody. And in the beginning, we could see that was really working against Yan. Yan was feeling the power, the low kicks were working. But over time, Aldo's, I guess, impatience started wearing out because his cardio was starting to go. He had been hurt in the first round, and we just started seeing Aldo slowly unravel a little bit. The shots in third and fourth round, I felt like they were more like "fuck you, get off of me" rounds than they were actual punches that were trying to hurt Volk. And I know I said this to you guys earlier.
Hurt Volk?
Volk. Oh, my bad. Yan.
I had to call that out because someone else was going to if I didn't. So.
Oh, yeah. No, I think we said this earlier that Aldo has, kind of poor technique. I wouldn't say it's like absolutely the worst technique, but it's technique that comes from years of not bending your knees very much. And you can see it when he throws body shots. He always falls onto one foot. When he throws hooks, everything, he just kind of like hops into his hooks and not so much like drives power with his knees and his hips into the punch. And that was really obvious because he started just exhausting himself punching on Jan's guard. And I know you guys are going to talk about Jan's guard later on, so the only thing I want to say is that this is a really promising performance from somebody that was, for all intents and purposes, supposed to be sent to slaughter against Jan. And I think we should all just sort of recognize that, Aldo can still have a good fight here and there, but he's just not going to be, the same Aldo that, is going to win the title and hold on to it for like 8-something years anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I think even more than Volk Max, in terms of like obvious adaptations, this was one of those fights because I think it was really a story of how Aldo had to navigate. Because I don't think Aldo wasn't shot in this fight. He looked very shot to me in a lot of ways, but it's a massive credit to him that he managed to still make a fight of it. And a lot of that was the adaptation he made after round 1. Yan, he was able to, because Yan's first rounds, they're never like, they're never the really aggressive rounds that we have come to expect from him later. They're filling out rounds, and he does that very well. But even there, Yan found a lot of offense, and I think he could have 10-8'd him there because Aldo got hit hard, and then he nearly got finished on the ground. And then Aldo started realizing, hey, I can't box with this guy because I just don't have the reaction time. So he started kicking him on the outside. He started landing big left hook flurries to the body, and it was a very courageous performance from him, but also a very smart one. He kicked him out of orthodox into southpaw and started kicking the crap out of his body there. But Yan, as we've come to know from him from like the Jimmy Rivera fight, for instance, a hard fight isn't necessarily a death knell for Jan's chances at winning, and especially when Aldo was going to fade down the stretch anyway. But, to Jan's credit, he did a lot of very smart things to make sure that happened. He started, for example, when Aldo started pivoting out, Yan just turned around and followed him out of it. It was one thing that Aldo couldn't really keep Yan off of him, even after pivoting. He did a lot of jabbing from southpaw. Yan, once Aldo started tiring and tried to tie up with him, it was kind of done because being in the clinch with Yan is awful for anyone, especially when you're Aldo, who got lat dropped by Marlon Moraes. But it was a very courageous performance from Aldo against a guy who I don't think anyone puts this kind of fight up against Yan for a long time. Jimmy Rivera kind of did, but it wasn't this kind of fight. And if you put him against someone like Marlon Moraes, I think he might just get drowned in the clinch. Aljo might beat him, but on the feet, I don't know if anyone else can deal with Peter Yan the way Jose Aldo did, especially with the physical limitations he was dealing with. It was a great fight from Aldo, but more importantly, it was a fight that showed how great he was.
So I want to, not to make this a semantics issue, but I do kind of want to address it because I think it's worth talking about. We say the word shot, and when we usually say it, it generally means like, physically slower, maybe the durability is gone, the speed may be eroding, and they're just not the same physical fighter, and that means they are unable to be the same fighter that they were. But when we say it, we usually say it in a fighter who we expect absolutely nothing from. Aldo has declined. Like, I am not arguing that he isn't, I don't think he's the same physical fighter that he was against Chad Mendes at, UFC 179. I don't think he's even the same technical fighter that he was against Max Holloway at UFC 218. I think he has declined. However, he did not look like washed in the way that I expect. And there's one key thing. This was Aldo's highest pace fight ever, which I had a hard time believing until I saw it. This was his highest pace fight ever. He had never had a fight where he threw more strikes than this one against Peter Yan, who is in his own right a pace machine. Like, the guy is just a chainsaw. So I was stunned to see that, and it made me rethink, like, okay, yes, I realize Aldo's declined, but I also want to highlight, like, I don't think there are many fighters, as Sriram said, who could have put up the same fight against Peter Yan. I do not think there are a lot of fighters that could have withstood this version of Aldo at bantamweight, which I never ever thought I'd be saying out loud. But, like, he was hitting Yan with body shots that we've seen drop featherweights. Like, it's I was amazed. And Yan, to his credit, Yan figured out, like, around, sort of late in the third round, which I still scored for Aldo. Like, I need to start extending exchanges more, punching past the point where Aldo's comfortable. Because Aldo's generally used to, in exchanges, he tends to scare guys off. Like, he'll throw, and then that kind of ends the exchange because he hits so much harder and he's just so much faster. He can respond to them in real time. And it was kind of, Max was a guy who he just was never scared in exchanges. He kept initiating. He kept forcing Aldo to respond past the point where Aldo was comfortable. And he started extending exchanges beyond that when Aldo slowed down. And Yan came to the same idea. But I think Yan also realized how dangerous Aldo was in the early going. And that's why he was so cautious. Like, that's why he led with so many feints. I think they actually both had periods where they were kind of feigning each other out. Yan was actually able to feint out some of Aldo's coiled punches. Aldo managed to feint out some of Jan's kicks and then, counter him. I really want to emphasize, the takeaway is not, as our friend Iggy pointed out on Twitter, the takeaway is not that, like, the game has passed Aldo by, or that he's, because this didn't look like a fight from, like, Aldo didn't exactly look like a relic here. The takeaway is also not Peter Yan is an overrated mess because he had to deal with Jose Aldo, who everyone expected to be finished. I think that there's a middle ground there. This, again, there are still some issues with Peter Yan. He has a bit of a Gaethje problem. Well, I don't even know if it's a problem that Gaethje has anymore, but the kind of ducking high guard, it can tend to just be a shell. He looks to slip and catch and pitch, but it's not It's not as frequent as it sometimes needs to be. Aldo's jab and sort of long right hand did needle down the center a fair bit, which was wise. But like, again, you sort of have to look at how Jan overcame that, because I don't think it wasn't just Aldo slowing down is the thing that I'm trying to say. Like, it wasn't just Aldo hitting a point and then no longer throwing strikes. He kept throwing past the point of being just bloody exhausted. And Jan continually had to he was like, if I need to win, I need to push this guy past the breaking point. I need to get him to the point where he's throwing strikes, just plain exhausted, and I can keep this pace and he cannot. And he found his way there. He worked the body. His body punching was beautiful. Actually, both of their body punching was beautiful in this fight. But it was, his long combinations from like down the center were excellent. It was always a question of pace, but we need to acknowledge how difficult it is to push this sort of pace on Aldo. Our friend Simon pointed out, like, this fight definitely proves that what Max Holloway did to Jose Aldo, he was probably sitting watching this fight like, yeah, it's not so easy, is it? Like, not everybody who fights at a high pace can expect to do this. Do we want to talk a little bit about Aldo trying out a more Thai-inspired style? Julian, you were talking about this a little bit live, and I was seeing it, and I was like, but I almost couldn't believe it. I'm like, is he trying to be more of like a Thai stylist in the second round? What do you think?
Yeah, I actually got this like I gotta like talk about it a lot on Twitter because somebody was being kind of reductivist. I think he made like a list of like nine, like I think it was like half of the top 15 that would beat Jan, just because he deduced that it was just Aldo throwing right hands and low kicks. That's all you need to beat Jan, and that's just really not the case. And I think Aldo's stance change was kind of actually brilliant because he figured that Jan wasn't going to take him down because Aldo just has the best hips in the world. He's just going to get out even if he is 135 Aldo. And he sort of figured that if Jan is going to keep trying to kick my body, I need to just defend my body. Jan is going to kick my legs out because I have better leg kicks than Jan. So Aldo started just using like a cross body check with his lead leg, which is something that we never see in MMA. And that's because if you do that, you're going to get swept, right? Like Max Holloway does this really well. He just he lets guys throw kicks at him and he'll just run in and sweep you. And Jan just couldn't do that because Jan was more focused on, defending his head, defending his liver, and, blocking the low kicks. And that just sort of worked really well from Aldo. But, like we said earlier, once Aldo started adding pivots to it, Jan was starting to figure it out. But it was just a really cool thing that we never expected that anybody in MMA could do, which was sort of like horse trot on the spot and then sort of check kicks with your lead leg. It's something that we're just not going to see very often unless, we have like another super great takedown defender like Aldo that just doesn't get taken down no matter what. I don't think we're going to see, lead leg checking very often.
Yeah, just the pivot generally, even without the stance, just the pivot to kicking Yan on the outside was pretty brilliant. As I mentioned at the beginning, Aldo's defense looked pretty atrophied, especially just on that first strike, because a lot of what Yan could do was just like reach in from the outside. Even when he wasn't really building on anything in the first round, he could just reach in from the outside and hit Aldo fairly cleanly. So it was like Aldo can't really respond in the pocket to those shots anymore. So he just started kicking Yan from the outside, taking his mobility away, kicking his body once he switched to southpaw, and hitting his body from the outside in like these longer flurries that just as Yan was shelled up. But Yan eventually, he found a way to make those longer pocket exchanges anyway, which is the biggest credit to him in my opinion, because a lot of times guys can't really enforce a cardio advantage against Aldo. That was like, even in his prime, you were like, Aldo takes rounds off. How will he deal with Frankie Edgar just being there for 5 rounds? And it turned out pretty well, like both times. So Yan being able to counter the body shots with left hooks and turn that into long combinations and clinch his life away late in the fight. It was incredible considering how much of a pivot Aldo made to the kicking game from round 2 into round 3, because it's a really rare sort of fight where you find both guys adapting. And this was, as Danny mentioned in the adjustment article, it was that kind of fight where both guys adapted to the other's adjustment.
Yeah, like I think that kind of sums it up. Like I think you do have to give a lot of credit to Peter Yan. Like I don't at all think that this was a bad showing from Aldo, or that he's just some shot to pieces and Yan is an overrated bum for struggling with him. Yeah, like this version of Aldo, like again, when you get a fighter like this at this point in their career, it's hard to trust them to do this a lot of times over. Like after this, another like brutal 5-round fight, the highest paced fight he's ever had. I don't know how many more times I can trust Aldo to do that. But I think you have to give Aldo enormous amounts of credit because like I said, no one was ever expecting him to get back to a title. A lot of it did come from, kind of some bureaucracy, but whatever. He ended up here and he fought his heart out. Like there are few competitors in this sport with the same spirit and will as Jose Aldo. There just are not that many. And to match that with, again, his skill and his ability to adjust, even given where I think, as you said, Sriram, some of his technique is atrophied. Physically, I don't think he's the same fighter, but it's such a rare kind of thing that you will almost never see a fighter do this late in his career. Like, yes, it made me sad. Yes, it bummed me out. But at the same time, I think I kind of found myself even more just in awe of Jose Aldo. And just, I don't want people to ever forget what kind of special fighter he is. There's a reason he was on the Fight Site's #1 in our top 20 countdown. Like, that nothing that happened in this fight has changed my opinion on that one bit. So I would agree. I think that Peter Yan versus Jose Aldo and Volkanovsky versus Holloway 2 are instant classics in my book. I love them both, and I'm going to watch them a lot, many times over the next years. And I think there's a ton of stuff to mine technically and in a broader sense just about the sport itself from these fights. And I think we should recognize that. We were lucky to have seen them. So let's move on to kind of the last segment that we got here, which is some upcoming previews. Again, I don't think they'll take too long. But we got Calvin Kattar versus Dan Ige tomorrow. This one seems pretty cut and dry. Julian, what are you thinking?
It's probably like a Kattar. I think Kattar either takes a decision or he just kind of just knocks out Ige, like over time, like 5 rounds. Probably like the 5th, 4th round knockout for Kattar. I just think that, like Ige, Ige does his thing, but I think Kattar just will probably do a bit better on the back foot. I don't know if Ige will go really heavy with the low kicks. He might. But even then, I think just the reach advantage might be an issue for Ige, and I can just see him walking into a counter like Shane did. I don't know, Sriram, what do you think?
Yeah, pretty much the same place. I watched a bit of Ige beforehand, and I think I really do like Ige for just in a broad developmental sort of sense, because when you look at the Arce fight, it wasn't an encouraging one moving forward for Dan Ige, but he turned into something pretty impressive against like Mirsad Bektic and against even Edson Barboza. I think he lost that fight pretty clearly, but it was an encouraging performance in terms of A, toughness, and B, kind of figuring out what he needed to do through the fight when his first plan didn't really work out at all. But that said, I think Kattar's pretty much the worst nightmare you could find for him at the weight class. And I'm generally pretty hesitant to say that because when I'm confident in a fight, it never works out that way. And it's bound to make me sad. But I think it's because if you look at Ige, he's not very good on the lead, in my opinion. Like, he can jab a bit, but a lot of what he did against Edson Barboza were like these wide winging flurries. And Kattar's a superb counterpuncher. The reach advantage, as you mentioned, so if he jabs, he's going to be stuck on the outside. Ige is not much of a leg kicker. He does it sometimes, but it's not something that he does consistently. And I think he's just completely outgunned. He nearly got knocked out in the first minute in the pocket exchange against Edson Barboza. And he's a legitimate puncher, both in terms of, mechanics and the heaviness of his hands. It's a really tough matchup. Ige could try to wrestle. I think that could be a solid path to like stealing some minutes. But Kattar's looked very urgent as an anti-wrestler at the very least. He's probably the better athlete here, in my opinion. So it's a rough fight. Ige, I think his best hope is either the wrestling or just starting really quick and catching Kattar cold. But even that hasn't really worked for the guys who have faced Kattar in the past. Regardless of like Kattar's ceiling at this point, and I think we all kind of disagree on that, I think Ige is not particularly the kind to take advantage of that.
Yeah. Ige has been an enormous like overperformer in the featherweight division, like for a guy who, just kind of showed up and in his first fight got pretty much just kind of worked by Julio Arce, and who's never really been that physical a threat. Maybe it's controversial to say that, but I don't really think of him as much of an athlete, to be honest. But he's just been one of these guys. He's just kept winning. And I look at him and I'm like, oh my God, he's on a 6-fight winning streak. How the hell did that happen? This does kind of feel like a style nightmare. Like, it feels like a lot of the same kinds of stuff that Julio Arce can do. I know Arce's a southpaw, but like, the same kind of interruptive jab is likely to give him issues. Ige's pretty crafty, but he's not really a good boxer necessarily. A lot of it is just just his grit. The fact that he'll just throw in heavier exchanges. He'll keep moving forward. I mean, he's got unbelievable heart. Like there's no doubt that Ige is just a gritty fighter. But that kind of implies that he's also going to get marked up pretty badly early by Calvin Kattar. The only thing that I'll say is that like it is kind of ironic that Ige took a pretty undeserved decision over Edson Barboza, because presumably Barboza would be in this position if Ige wasn't, and I would pick Barboza over Calvin Kattar without thinking twice. But as it stands, Ige does kind of feel like he just feels like there isn't anything that Calvin Kattar hasn't seen in Dan Ige. So I'm always hesitant to say it's going to be a wash, or not a wash, but it's going to be a completely one-sided. Because Kattar's made fights that I didn't think were going to be competitive. And like I said, Ige's super tough, and Julian, like you said, he might just hang in there for a while. But yeah, there's nothing really technical that I can. If you're looking for me to draw a path to victory for Ige, I don't really know what that looks like. Zabit only got one takedown very, very late against Kattar, and he kind of sold out on it. Like Kattar's clearly not easy to out wrestle, and it doesn't look like Ige has like the kind of back foot kicking to really disincentivize Kattar either. So seems pretty open and shut. Lastly, the fight that does not make any sense to me at all, but nonetheless we're getting, is Deiveson Figueiredo versus Joseph Benavidez 2. Julian, I saw you frowning earlier when I mentioned this. Why don't you tell me what you're thinking? Because I think I know.
I think I speak for everyone on the fight site. It's going to be a sad night. I think it was a pretty open and shut fight the first time they fought, and I think this is just a formality. I don't know, if Joe B can really make any big changes before the fight comes. If this was like a year later or a year and a half later, I can see him making some really big stylistic changes that could really change things up. But we saw from the first fight that, Joe B knew what kind of threat he was dealing with. And he just kind of walked into it. He didn't really have a choice. He just kind of just walked in. He did pretty well. He was starting to figure some things out. And then Figueretto just decided to just end his life, and he did. I don't really have much to say because I'm not a big, huge Joe B stan like everyone else is. But for me, God bless.
Couldn't have said it better myself. I think it's because before the first fight, I wrote something on the dynamic of the fight, and I think Figueredo fought perfectly in a way that made me look very smart there, but also was just a very smart way to fight in general. It was that a lot of what Joby does, right? It's very weird mechanically, but it's very, very smart as he moves down a fight. And I think the way that Figueredo fought, it was he forced the mechanics of each encounter to the forefront, where he would pressure Joby back. Joby would be forced to come forward rather than like being able to choose when he comes forward, feint in. Figueredo pressured hard, and he was able to just land a short right-hand counter every time, just cut him off at the pass when he squared up. So Joby essentially was punished for the way he stepped forward in that fight, rather than anything he could like actually adjust, right? Because the way that Joby fights, it's a very blitzy sort of style that gets him a lot of undue criticism from some people because he ran into a headbutt in the fight for one, but like in general, it just doesn't look particularly safe. But despite all that, Joby's been very, very successful against very, very good fighters. But the fact that he has to shift in a lot of the time means that Figueredo could punish that pretty consistently with that short right hand. And Joby had a lot more trouble than he did against Sergio Pettis of extending those exchanges. Because like he tried to swing back at Figueredo, but Figueredo was big and long. And that first shot just stunned him enough that he couldn't like just eat it and keep going as quickly as he might have wanted to. So I think if Figueredo fights the same way and he's not like, destroyed by a weight cut or by the COVID thing that happened, like the quarantine and stuff, if he fights the same way, I don't know if Joby will have an answer. I want to trust Joby, and he deserves a title for like his entire career, but it's very hard for me to trust him here against someone like Figueredo, who's young and who clearly knows how to fight him.
Yep. This is mean. This is, like you said, this is a really mean piece of matchmaking and formality. I wouldn't consider myself like a Joby stan in the traditional sense, but I'm a Joby respecter. As I think we all are. Like, we all recognize how difficult it is to be a fighter at this high level for so long, and that he's assembled a pretty phenomenal resume over the years. Like, we've said it a lot on our site. Like, he is one of the best fighters ever, most likely. And I'll remember him as a great fighter who, maybe doesn't have a belt to his name, but this is a really sad kind of postscript because he just feels like he's being fed to the slaughter. I love Figueredo, and I think that, as you said, Sriram, Fig he had a lot of the right ideas, and I think similar to like a sort of classic Yoel Romero sort of way, Figueredo is a guy who tends to feel his approach out in a fight, which is why even if he starts a little bit slow, he never stops being threatening. There are a few weapons that he has at his disposal. He was hitting Joe B with body shots that looked like they would have dropped featherweights. It was brutal. And he sort of learns like when and how to pressure, how to herd guys into his punches. It's a strange game because it requires a lot of durability to like take the shots that his opponents are giving, and to, kind of configure a way through that. But he played it just about perfectly the first time around, and it's hard to see Joe B figure out a way around it. Like, Julian said, his only way to beat Figueredo is through him, and I don't really know if he has the physicality to do that anymore. So I think it's going to be kind of a bummer. And it does, as much as I like Figueredo and I'd love to see him hold the belt, this does feel like pointless matchmaking. Like, I think they could have just as easily given this fight to like Alex Perez or Pantoja or I don't know who else is at the top of the division, something like that. There's a lot of fun fights with Figueredo. I'm not really sure this is one of them. Seems like it's going to be kind of a bummer. So anyway,
Brandon Moreno's up there too.
Yeah, Moreno. Fuck it. I don't know, it doesn't matter. Like, there's a lot of really exciting. I'd be down to watch Figueredo fight just about anybody. And if they really want to move him up to bantamweight, I would be down to watch Figueredo fight just about anybody. Like, he is must watch MMA. There's no doubt. But this fight is mean. So anyway, I think that largely wraps up everything I wanted to say. How you guys feeling?
Bring Kyoji back, you cowards.
Yeah.
No, I think we missed an actual really fun fight at featherweight. I think it's listed as Jimmy Rivera versus Cody Stamann at featherweight.
At featherweight?
Yeah, it's listed as
1 week
featherweight.
notice. 1 week notice.
Oh, I didn't even know that was happening. Absolutely. Let's discuss that real quick.
And that's like an absolute banger, I think.
I don't have any notes on that, but let's talk about it. What are you thinking on that, Julian, since you brought it up?
I think it's actually just going to be a really fun fight. Rivera has pretty good takedown defense. I think this is a fight that Rivera is actually getting kind of a break. He's not fighting some monster pressure fighter that's just going to like run at him and just maul him on the fence, and isn't just going to like play with his feints very much. Cody's a very simplistic fighter, and that his game plan is probably going to try to take you down. But in his last fight against who was that? Boom Kelleher? Yeah, against Brian Kelleher, Cody Stamann started showing off a jab, and I was like, oh, this will probably be a really good banger, because I can see Stamann just trying to muscle his way through Rivera's jab and his initial attack, and then try to fight for takedowns. And I think it's just going to be a really fun scramble fest, especially at featherweight, where they're just not going to be cutting that much weight, and they're just going to just scramble all the time. Sriram?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's probably going to be mostly a striking battle, but Jimmy Rivera is a fighter that I've appreciated for a long time. I used to think he would be a contender. At this point, it's looking a bit less likely, to say the least, but I think he's genuinely terrific where he's good. I think there's a lot of comparisons to be made for Calvin Kattar with Jimmy Rivera in that, they're genuinely incredible on the back foot. They're good jabbers. They're very good combination punchers. They're not the best in dealing with kicks, and they're not the best in dealing with guys who can just like deny them their range entirely. We saw that with Aljamain Sterling for Jimmy Rivera, and we saw that with Zabit and Moicano for Calvin Kattar, where if they're boxers, they want to be boxing, and they're good at enforcing their range, but against someone who's better, they just really, really struggle because they don't have a plan B. So I think Jimmy Rivera, I don't think Cody Stamann's that kind of fighter. I think Stamann, he's either going to take the back foot and try to fight long, and he got crowded a bit by Brian Kelleher, so that's not really super reliable in my opinion, or he's going to try to wrestle Rivera. And Rivera's generally been absolutely terrific in terms of takedown defense. Aljamain Sterling really couldn't get much done. He was able to hold in the clinch a little bit, but couldn't really get him down. So I think it's a rough fight for Stamann stylistically. I'm just not particularly sure where Rivera is. But Rivera's a joy to watch. I watched the Dodson fight a little bit ago. It was a brilliant fight in terms of how he navigated those margins with a really, really scary puncher. So I think, and the Yan Aldo fight really raised the stock a bit, I would imagine, because Yan looked terrific there. He looked terrific against Rivera, and Rivera looked terrific against him. So I'm going to go with Rivera, but no, I think Rivera is probably going to stay like a hardcore favorite, what could have been type of fighter.
Yeah, I don't think Stamann has any, like, my general analysis, as I said, I didn't have any notes prepared on this. Apologies. But at the base level, it doesn't really seem like Stamann has the dynamism to really threaten Rivera with much. I don't think Stamann is a better clinch fighter or wrestler than Aljamain Sterling, and he certainly doesn't have the same reach and ability to draw guys onto his shots. If he is exchanging more neutral space, Rivera just seems like the cleaner, more polished technician, better idea of how to win rounds, more likely to land the shots that are, might discourage Stamann a bit from trying to engage. Seems pretty open and shut. You're right. I don't really know where Rivera is at, and it could be the type of thing where he just has a bad fall at any point. But at the same time, he hasn't ever really looked technically worse, in my opinion. And like I said, Stamann he just doesn't really have any kind of dynamism at all in a division that is built on, it is a extremely dynamic division. You've got big hitters, quick snatching submission threats, it's just a lot of bangers and sluggers. Like it's a violent, dynamic division, and Stamann just doesn't really quite have that. I mean, in fairness, Rivera doesn't really have that, but he's also converted that into a more reliable round-winning game. So yeah, it just seems like pick the more polished technician. That about does it for our show. Thank you, everyone who's listened. Thank you, Julian, for showing up once again. Happy to have you on anytime. Before we wrap up, do you guys have any articles that you're working on? Anything that you're trying to get out in the next couple of weeks? What are you thinking?
I'm looking at something on Aldo Yan because it was terrific, but I'm not I'm not sure of a time frame for that because, doing it justice is actually pretty hard. So I'm going to try for that, but don't hold me to it, I guess. And the staff pick should be out relatively soon at the time of recording.
Julian?
I think I got a video coming out on why Aljamain Sterling is greater than John Jones. I think we're just waiting for the copyright thing to get through. It's a controversial piece. Should definitely watch it. It's probably my longest one I've done to this date. And I think in a week or two, I'm going to have a Darren Till video coming out too. You, Danny?
Like I said, I had an MMA adjustment metagame piece that went up a week ago. I might try to actually revisit this Brad Riddell article that I've been trying. Because I was thinking about, like, do I want to do an article on Riddell's, like, high-level losses in kickboxing to Doumbé and Region Aircel, but I've already written about Doumbé and Region Aircel, so I might just write about Brad Riddell, and what he's done in the UFC so far, and, if he is anything like Alexander Volkanovsky, like, that his ceiling really could be quite high. I've had another idea for a metagame article on prioritization and training. I might have to kind of throw that one around a little bit more, but I've got an idea for it. But, who knows? There may be stuff that I want to write about in the future and in these next couple events. Next week, Sriram and I will be back, and we're going to be covering... What is next week? Is it...
Whitaker-Till.
Whitaker-Till? Oh boy. Okay, well, that'll be fun.
For sure.
And in the meantime, please continue to support the Fight Site. You can read all our stuff on the website. Check out Hyperfly. We're sponsored now. We got real advertisements. Look at us. We're killing it right now. I don't know if I have a whole spiel for it. I haven't practiced one, but go support Hyperfly. You can click the link on our website. Scroll all the way down. That just about does it. Thank you guys. Stay safe.